The rain that night was not the polite kind that makes city streets look cinematic in photographs. It was the kind that soaks through a jacket in 40 seconds flat and turns every alley in the warehouse district into a shallow river running nowhere fast. And somewhere in the middle of all that rain, at exactly 1:47 in the morning, a woman was running for her life. She was not running well, but she was running. The Meridian Room sat below street level on the eastern end of Calloway Street, tucked behind an unmarked freight entrance that looked, to any ordinary person passing by, like the loading dock of a building that hadn't been used since the 90s. There was no sign. There was no handle on the outside of the door. There was nothing to suggest that behind that reinforced steel frame sat one of the most quietly powerful private rooms in the entire city, which was, of course, precisely the point. Inside, the air carried the kind of stillness that only exists when powerful men are not in a hurry. Dark mahogany panels lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A crystal chandelier hung above the center of the room, dimmed to about 40%, enough light to see clearly, low enough to remind everyone present that this was not a place for full transparency. A Persian rug, the kind that costs more than most people's cars, stretched across the hardwood floor. And in the middle of it all, behind a low glass table holding a whiskey glass and a cigar resting in a heavy-based tray, sat Dario Vesper. He was not a large man in the way that people expect dangerous men to be large. He was lean, composed, and dressed in a charcoal suit that had clearly been cut for his body and no one else's. His hands were folded in his lap. His expression gave away absolutely nothing, which, to anyone who knew him, was the most unsettling thing about him. On paper, Dario Vesper was a private equity consultant with holdings in commercial real estate, import logistics, and 2 licensed casino operations. In reality, he held the kind of authority that does not get printed on business cards or filed with the SEC. He controlled the city's southern docking routes, 3 underground card houses, and enough political IOUs to make an alderman sweat at the mention of his name. Seated to his left was Rael Okonkwo, his head of security, a broad-shouldered man with a stillness about him that was less relaxed and more coiled, like something waiting for a reason to move. They had been reviewing a set of shipping ledgers for the better part of an hour, the kind of quiet work that gets done at night, because the people involved prefer not to be watched doing it. That quiet ended without warning. The freight door did not open so much as it surrendered. The reinforced frame buckled inward with a sound like a starting pistol going off inside a library, a sharp, cracking bang that swallowed the ambient hum of the room whole. Rael was standing before the echo finished, his right hand already inside his jacket. The 3 men stationed around the room's perimeter moved in the same breath, weapons drawn, weight shifted forward, eyes trained on the entrance. Dario did not stand. He picked up his whiskey glass and held it. Through the broken doorway came a woman. She was soaked through completely, dark brown hair stuck flat against her face, blue shirt pressed against her skin, jeans heavy with rainwater. She was not running anymore. She was moving the way people move when they have already spent everything they had and are now borrowing against whatever comes after. One hand braced against the door frame. The other pressed hard against her left side, holding something in that clearly needed holding in. She crossed the threshold and made it perhaps 4 steps before her knees found the Persian rug. Not a single gun lowered. Dario raised one finger. Just one. And every weapon in the room went still. He studied her from across the room with the unhurried attention of a man who has learned, at considerable cost, never to react before he understands. He set his glass down and rose slowly, his polished shoes crossing the hardwood floor without any particular urgency, the way a person moves when they are the least threatened individual in any room they walk into. He stopped about 2 feet from where she knelt, looked down at her, and then looked briefly at the spreading stain darkening the left side of her shirt. "Bleeding on a rug that is older than this building," he said. His voice was even, unhurried, and carried the particular weight of someone who has never once needed to raise it to be heard. "That makes you either very desperate or very stupid. I'm genuinely hopping for your sake it's the first one." Woman lifted her head. Her face was pale and drawn tight with pain, but her eyes, a sharp, clear gray, were entirely focused. She was not looking at the guns. She was not looking at Rael, who could have snapped her in half with one arm and knew it. She was looking directly at Dario, with the kind of concentrated attention that people reserve for the one person in a room who actually matters. "Vesper," she said. Her voice was ragged at the edges but surprisingly steady at the center. "And you're uninvited," he replied. She exhaled slowly, reached into the breast pocket of her soaked shirt. Every man in the room tensed, and pulled out a small encrypted data drive, sealed in a waterproof casing no bigger than a thumb. She held it up between two fingers like a person presenting their last remaining bargaining chip, which was, in fact, exactly what she was doing. "My name is Sloane Mercer," she said. "I'm a forensic investigator with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. Or I was, until about 6 hours ago, when two of Senator Aldous Cren's contracted marshals put a round in my side and left me in a drainage channel on the south end of the docks." She paused, swallowed, and kept going. "This drive contains the complete financial architecture of Cren's narcotics laundering operation, account chains, shell company registrations, wire transfer logs, and the full Varkov syndicate import ledger going back 31 months. She looked up at him steadily. "The Varkov people have been expanding through your docking routes for the better part of a year. You already know that. What you don't know yet is who inside your own operation has been letting them." Room was very quiet. Dario looked at the drive. Then he looked at her. The expression on his face had not changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted, the small, almost imperceptible adjustment of a man recalculating. "You came here bleeding and uninvited," he said slowly, "to tell me that my operation has a leak and that a senator and an Eastern European cartel are the ones holding the bucket." He tilted his head slightly. "Why bring this to me and not to the remaining federal contacts on your unit's roster?" "Because Cren bought them first," Sloane said flatly. "And because the Varkov syndicate is currently your problem whether you've accepted that or not." She lowered the drive but did not put it away. "I'm not asking you to save me out of kindness, Mr. Vesper. I'm offering you a transaction. The data on this drive is worth more to you than the cost of keeping me alive long enough to decrypt it." She held his gaze without blinking. "But I need a doctor in the next 20 minutes, or neither of us is getting anything out of this conversation." Dario Vesper looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then he turned very calmly and looked at Rail. "Dr. Fenwick," he said, "and closed the door. Doctor." Fenwick arrived in 11 minutes. That in itself told Sloane something useful about the kind of operation she had walked into. A private physician who answers a phone call at 1:47 in the morning and shows up in under a quarter hour does not do so because he respects the Hippocratic Oath. He does so because he respects the man who called him. She filed that detail away quietly, the way she filed everything, not because she planned to use it, but because she had learned a long time ago that the details you ignore are always the ones that kill you later. While they waited, nobody put their weapons away entirely. The three men around the perimeter had holstered up, but their jackets remained open and their hands stayed close. Rail stood a few feet behind Dario with his arms folded, watching Sloane the way you watch a street dog that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to bite. Dario himself had returned to the sofa. He did not offer her a chair. To be fair, she was already on the floor, and moving seemed like a project she was not ready to take on. "Walk me through the drive," he said. He had picked up his whiskey again, not because he was thirsty, but because a man like Dario Vesper does not let discomfort show in his hands. "Everything on it. Don't summarize. I don't make decisions based on summaries." Sloane shifted her weight slightly on her knees, keeping her left hand pressed against her side. The bleeding had slowed to something manageable, which she took as a minor professional courtesy from her own body. 31 months of inbound wire transfers, she said, routed through 4 shell companies registered in Cyprus, 2 in the Cayman Islands, and 1 in Luxembourg that technically belongs to a real estate holding group that technically belongs to nobody the Varkov syndicate would like you to be able to trace. She paused to breathe. Underneath all of that is a narcotics import ledger cross-referenced against Cren's infrastructure budget appropriations. He has been using federal construction contracts as a clean money funnel. Every dollar Varkov moves through this city gets washed through a road that doesn't need to be built and a bridge that doesn't need to be repaired. Dario turned the whiskey glass slowly in his hand. "And your unit found this." "I found it," she said, with a precision that made the distinction clear. "My unit found out I found it, which is why I spent tonight swimming through a drainage channel instead of filing a report." Something at the corner of Dario's mouth moved, though calling it a smile would be overstating the case. "You said the Varkov people have been moving through my docking routes," he said. "I want specifics. Names, shipment windows, which of my dock supervisors was sloppy enough to let that happen? That information is on the drive, Sloane said, along with the name of the person inside your organization who made sure the supervisors looked the other way at the right times. She met his eyes steadily. Which is why I came to you and not to anyone else. You have a problem you don't fully know the shape of yet. I have the full picture, and I need 3 things. I assumed you did, Dario said. Medical attention tonight, she said. 24 hours of protection while I stabilize and prepare the data package for distribution, and a clean route out of the city once the transfer is done. She held the drive up once more, briefly, then lowered it. Everything on this drive becomes yours the moment you agree. Kren's network, Varkov's import chain, your internal leak, all of it. You can do with it whatever you think is appropriate. Dario looked at the drive for a moment, then he looked at her. Rehearse that, he said. Twice, she said. Once in the drainage channel and once while I was picking the lock on your door. The lock, by the way, has a secondary tumbler bypass that your installer didn't seal properly. You should get that fixed. Rail blinked. It was the closest thing to a reaction she had gotten from him all night. The door opened, and Dr. Fenwick stepped in. A compact, gray-haired man carrying a medical bag that looked professional enough to belong in a proper clinic, and worn enough to suggest it had seen considerably more field work than a proper clinic would approve of. He assessed the situation in about 3 seconds, crossed to Sloane without being directed, and crouched beside her with the business-like ease of a man who has patched up people in worse positions in worse rooms. Dario stood and moved toward the far side of the room, his back briefly to her, hands clasped behind him. He stayed like that for a moment, looking at the middle distance the way people do when they are running a calculation that involves more variables than they would like. Then he turned back around. I'm not going to tell you yes, he said, and I'm not going to tell you no. He looked at her with an expression that was entirely unreadable and possibly intentionally so. What I'm going to tell you is that Dr. Fenwick is going to stop you from bleeding out on that rug, and that you are going to sleep somewhere that is not a drainage channel, and that we will have a considerably more structured conversation in the morning. He picked up his whiskey glass and walked toward the inner hallway. In my world, Ms. Mercer, the difference between yes and no is almost always a night's sleep and a clearer head. He paused at the doorway without turning around. Keep the drive in your hand if it makes you feel better, he said. Nobody in this building is going to take it from you tonight. Then he was gone, and the room settled back into its particular brand of quiet. Sloane exhaled slowly and let Dr. Fenwick do his work. She woke up on a bed that was entirely too comfortable for the kind of night she had just survived. For a few seconds, Sloane lay still and did what she always did when she came back to consciousness in an unfamiliar place. She listened before she moved. The room was quiet. No voices, no footsteps, no sounds of anything urgent happening nearby. Pale gray morning light was coming in through curtains that were almost fully drawn. The ceiling above her was clean, high, and corniced in a way that suggested the building had better bones than its freight entrance implied. Her side ached with the deep, settled throb of something that had been properly treated, but was not going to let her forget about it. She looked down. The wound had been dressed cleanly, and her shirt replaced with a plain white one that was several sizes too large. The data drive was still in her hand. She had held it through the entire night without realizing it. Good morning, said Dario Vesper. He was seated in an armchair near the window, one leg crossed over the other, a thin manila folder open across his knee. He was in a fresh suit, charcoal again, slightly lighter than the one from last night, and he was holding a cup of coffee that had clearly been there long enough to no longer be hot. He did not look like a man who had lost any sleep. He looked like a man who had simply moved his working hours to a different room. Sloane pushed herself upright against the headboard carefully and looked at the folder. That's my personnel file, she said. It is, Dario agreed, without any particular apology in his voice. My personnel file is classified at federal level, she said. It was, he said, and turned a page. She let that sit for a moment. There was no real point in being outraged about it. She had walked into the man's building uninvited and bleeding and asked him to trust her. The fact that he had spent the night verifying who she actually was demonstrated a level of professional thoroughness she could at least respect, even if she found it personally inconvenient. What does it say? She asked. That you have been with the Financial Crimes Unit for 6 years, he said. That you were rated as the top forensic analyst in your division for 3 of those years, and that 4 months ago you were placed on an internal review for accessing case files outside your assigned jurisdiction. Glanced up at her briefly. Kren's files, I assume. Infrastructure contracts, she said. I found a pattern in a completely unrelated corporate audit and followed it further than I was supposed to. That is when the problems started, Dario said. That is when the problems started, she confirmed. He closed the folder and set it on the side table. Then he picked up his coffee, looked at it, decided against it, and set it down again. The sample, he said. I want to see it this morning. Not a summary, not a verbal description. I want to sit across from you and watch you open the drive and show me something that confirms the data is structured the way you say it is. Need a laptop, Sloane said. And I need it to be air-gapped, not connected to any network, internal or external. If this drive is detected by a remote scan before I authorize the final transfer, there is a failsafe that wipes the partition and I lose the only leverage I have. Dario looked at her with an expression that suggested he found competence in other people mildly interesting. Rail will have one ready within the hour, he said. What else do you need? Coffee, she said. Something to eat that isn't from a vending machine. And I need to know exactly how many people in this building are aware I'm here. 7, he said. Rail, Dr. Fenwick, the 2 men who carried you upstairs, and the 3 who were in the room last night. Dr. Fenwick will not speak about it for reasons that predate your arrival. The 2 men who carried you upstairs are not paid to have opinions. The 3 from last night know better than to develop new habits of conversation. He paused. Does that satisfy the question? It narrows the risk profile, she said, which was not quite the same as saying yes, and they both knew it. A light knock at the door produced a younger man carrying a tray with coffee and toast, who set it on the table near the window, avoided eye contact with both of them, and left without being spoken to. Sloane swung her legs off the bed carefully, stood slightly slower than she would have liked, and moved to the chair across from Dario. She set the drive on the table between them. Here is what I'm prepared to offer, she said, wrapping both hands around the coffee cup. I'll decrypt a single partition from the drive. The Cyprus accounts, specifically, because those are the cleanest thread and the easiest to verify independently. That gives you enough to confirm the quality of the full dataset without me handing you everything before we've agreed on terms. Dario considered that with the same expression he appeared to use for most things, which was to say, no expression at all. And the terms you want in return for the full dataset, the same 3 I named last night, she said. Medical cover for the next 24 hours, physical protection until the full transfer is done, and a clean exit route out of the city once it's complete. She looked at him steadily. I don't need you to like me, Mr. Vesper. I don't need you to trust me. I just need you to agree that our interests are aligned enough to make this worth both of our time. Dario was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city was beginning to make its morning noises, distant traffic, the low drone of something industrial running on the docks far below. Show me the Cyprus accounts, he said finally. We'll go from there. Neither of them shook hands on it. That kind of gesture implies a level of goodwill that neither of them was pretending to have. But an agreement had been reached, in the particular way that agreements get reached between people who do not trust each other and have decided, for the time being, that it does not matter. The Cyprus accounts took 40 minutes to decrypt and about 4 minutes for Dario to understand completely. That second number was the one that impressed Sloane, though she did not say so out loud. Most people, when presented with a layered shell company structure, need someone to draw them a diagram and explain it twice. Dario had followed the transfer chain on a single read-through, asked 2 precise clarifying questions, and then sat back and said nothing for almost a full minute, which she had come to understand was his version of being thoroughly convinced. They had moved downstairs to a side room off the main parlor smaller, with a single table, 2 chairs, and an air-gapped laptop that Rail had produced without comment or questions. The drive sat between them. The decrypted partition glowed on the screen in rows of account numbers, transfer timestamps, and shell company registrations that looked, to the untrained eye, like the world's most boring spreadsheet, and were, to the trained eye, a federal indictment waiting to happen. Kren has been running this for how long? Dario asked. The earliest transaction I can trace is 34 months ago, Sloane said, but the structure is too clean for a first attempt. He almost certainly had an earlier version running before that. This is the iteration that got confident. Confident, Dario repeated, as if the word itself told him something about the senator's character. When people get away with something long enough, Sloane said, they stop building in contingencies. The early transfers are routed through 6 layers. By month 18, he's down to 3. She pointed to a cluster of entries near the bottom of the screen. He got comfortable. That's the only reason I found it at all. Dario looked at the screen for another moment, then looked at her. Something in his assessment had shifted since the night before, not warmth exactly, but a kind of revised respect, the way a person looks at a tool they initially underestimated. The Varkov ledger is in a separate partition, locked behind a second key, she said, which I will provide when we've agreed the terms are holding. He nodded once, slowly. It was the most straightforward acknowledgement she had received from him since she arrived, and she decided to take it for what it was. Then, at 12 minutes past noon, Rail appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man delivering news he would prefer not to be delivering. 2 federal marshals at the front entrance, he said. Warrant paperwork. They're asking for access to the building. Sloane went very still. Dario did not. He closed the laptop himself, stood, and looked at Rail with the unhurried composure of someone who had been anticipating this particular knock since approximately 2 o'clock that morning. Which 2? He asked. Rail described them briefly. Sloane recognized both descriptions without needing to hear the names. Those are the men who shot me, she said. I assumed as much, Dario said. He straightened his jacket and looked at Rail. Get Holloway on the phone. Tell him I need him at this address in the next 15 minutes and that he should bring his full documentation kit. He paused. And make sure nobody opens that front door until he arrives. Rail was already moving. Holloway turned out to be a lawyer, a slim, unremarkable-looking man in his late 50s who arrived in 14 minutes carrying a leather briefcase and the particular energy of someone who genuinely enjoys this kind of situation more than he lets on. He greeted Dario with a nod, said nothing to anyone else, and walked directly to the front entrance. Sloane stayed in the side room with the drive and listened through the wall. She could not hear the full exchange, but she heard enough. The marshals presented their warrant. Holloway asked to examine it, at length, while a second member of his team photographed every page. There was a period of back and forth that had the specific rhythm of a legal professional methodically dismantling a document in front of the people who issued it. Then Holloway's voice, calm and carrying clearly through the wall, delivered what sounded like a prepared statement that ended with the words, "District Court Judge physically present." Few minutes after that, the front door closed. Holloway appeared in the side room doorway, set his briefcase down, and looked at Dario with a mildly satisfied expression. The warrant has 3 procedural deficiencies that would get it thrown out before a clerk finished reading the cover page, he said. I've documented all of them and sent copies to the issuing office's oversight board as of 5 minutes ago. He paused. I also noted the supervising marshal's direct line and made it clear that any subsequent visit to these premises without a sitting district court judge present will result in a formal misconduct filing against both officers personally. He glanced briefly toward Sloane, then back to Dario. They know it was hollow. They came here to see what you would do, not to actually execute the warrant. Now they know, Dario said. Now they know, Holloway agreed, and left without further ceremony. Dario turned back to the room. He picked up the closed laptop from the table, held it for a moment, and then set it back down. They came here personally, Sloane said, which means Kren knows I made it through the night and he knows roughly where I am and he has decided that the legal approach is worth attempting before the other kind. She looked at Dario steadily. The other kind will follow, probably not today, but soon. I know, Dario said. That doesn't concern you, she said. It was not quite a question. It concerns me enormously, he said simply. Concern and panic are different things. I find only one of them useful. He looked at her for a moment. Finish your coffee, Ms. Mercer. We have preparations to make before this stops being a legal conversation. Outside, somewhere in the city, 2 federal marshals were making a phone call that neither of them wanted to make to a senator who was not going to take the news well. The afternoon passed in a state of controlled tension that Sloane was beginning to recognize as Dario Vesper's default operating mode. After the marshals left, the building had quietly shifted gears in a way that was not loud enough to call alarming, but deliberate enough to notice. 2 additional men had appeared on the ground floor without being introduced. Rail had conducted 2 separate phone calls from the corridor outside the side room, speaking in a low, unhurried voice that carried just enough to confirm he was repositioning people somewhere. A lunch tray arrived for Sloane at 1:30. Nobody brought anything for themselves, which told her that the people in this building ate when the situation allowed and did not make a habit of announcing their appetites. She spent most of the afternoon at the table with the air-gapped laptop, not decrypting anything further, but reviewing her own documentation. The structural map of Kren's transfer network that she had been building in her head for 4 months and had finally committed to the drive in the 72 hours before everything came apart. She wanted to be certain that when the time came to hand the full dataset over, she could walk Dario through it in a single sitting without gaps. At 17 minutes past 6 in the evening, Rail came through the door without knocking. "South Dock Warehouse," he said to Dario, who was on the far side of the room. "Bonded storage, Unit 4. Fire crews are on the scene. It's gone." Room was quiet for a moment. Dario was standing near the window with his hands in his jacket pockets. He did not turn around immediately. He stayed exactly where he was for a few seconds, looking at nothing in particular through the glass, and then he turned around with the same measured composure he appeared to bring to every piece of information regardless of its weight. "Accelerant?" he asked. 3 points of origin," Rail said. "Professional spread, nothing recoverable inside." "What was in it?" Sloane asked. Rail glanced at her briefly, then at Dario, who gave a small nod that apparently constituted permission to answer. "Bonded import stock," Rail said. "Roughly 2.4 million in declared goods, twice that in undeclared." He paused. "It was not our most important warehouse. It was chosen specifically because losing it hurts without crippling us. They wanted us to feel it without taking us off our feet." Sloane looked at Dario. "That's Varkov's signature," she said. "It's in the ledger. He uses incremental property damage as a negotiation opening. He burns something peripheral first to establish that he can reach you, and then he waits to see whether you come to the table or hold your position." She paused. "He's not expecting you to fold. He's measuring how long it takes you to react." "Then we won't give him a useful data point," Dario said. He moved away from the window and looked at Rail. "Get Corso on the phone. Tell him I want the estate prepared for an extended occupancy by tomorrow morning." Full perimeter staffing, the eastern generator brought online, and the secondary comms system tested before we arrive. He glanced briefly at Sloane. "We're moving tonight. The interstate route?" Rail asked. "We'll discuss routing separately," Dario said, and the way he said it made clear that particular conversation was not going to happen in front of anyone who didn't need to know. "Give me 20 minutes. Rail left. Dario looked at Sloane with an expression that was almost businesslike enough to be reassuring. "Estate is outside the city," he said. "It is a considerably more defensible position than this building, which was never designed to be held under sustained pressure. It has its own power supply, its own communications infrastructure, and enough distance from the city's jurisdiction lines to make an unofficial visit considerably more complicated for anyone who might be considering one." "How far outside the city?" she asked. 40 minutes in good conditions," he said. "Longer tonight because we will not be taking the direct route." He studied her for a moment. "How is the side?" The question was practical rather than concerned, and she answered it in the same register. "Manageable," she said. "I won't be running anywhere, but I can move." "You won't need to run," he said. "You'll be in an armored vehicle." She nodded and looked at the drive on the table. There was a question sitting between them that neither had addressed yet, the same question that had been sitting there since the warehouse report came in and confirmed, in the most direct language available, that the Varkov syndicate already knew she was here. "They found me faster than I expected," she said. "Yes," Dario said. "Which means either they tracked the drive's signal somehow, which they can't, because it has no active component, or someone told them where to look." She kept her eyes on the drive. "Your internal leak, Mr. Vesper. Whatever is on this partition, it's already being used." Room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere far below on the south side of the city, a building that had been standing since the early 90s was finishing the process of burning to the ground because a woman with a data drive had knocked on the wrong door. Or, depending on how you looked at it, exactly the right one. Dario picked up his phone and began to dial Corso's number. Before the call connected, he looked across at Sloane with the steady, unreadable expression she was beginning to understand was the closest he got to showing his hand. "Whatever you need from this room," he said. "We leave at 10. They left at 10, as Dario said they would, 3 vehicles. a lead SUV carrying 2 of Rail's men up front and a third in the back. An armored center vehicle, where Sloane sat behind tinted glass with the drive in her jacket pocket and Dario beside her, reading something on his phone with the focused calm of a man on a long commute. A third vehicle trailing behind with 2 more men and whatever equipment Rail had decided the evening warranted. The convoy moved through the city's late-night streets without attracting attention, which was the point. They looked, from the outside, like the kind of corporate transport that wealthy people use because they have learned that being noticed is almost never in their interest. For the first 40 minutes, the drive was uneventful. The city thinned out gradually as they moved toward the outer interstate, the dense grid of lit buildings giving way to longer stretches of dark road, and the particular emptiness that exists on the outskirts of a city at night. Sloane watched it through the window without speaking. Dario had not spoken either, which she had come to understand was not unfriendliness so much as efficiency. He did not fill silence for the sake of it. At 11:19, the convoy entered the canyon stretch, a 2-mile corridor where the interstate ran between 2 elevated rock faces, one of which supported a service road on each side. It was the kind of geography that looks entirely unremarkable on a map and looks entirely different when you are inside it, and someone has decided it is the right place to stop you. At 11:20, the lead SUV ceased to exist as a functional vehicle. The explosion was not the enormous cinematic kind. It was compact and directional, a single RPG round that hit the front axle and flipped the vehicle sideways across both lanes in a movement that took less than 2 seconds, and produced a wall of fire and twisted metal that blocked the road completely. Sloane's hands went to the seat in front of her before she had consciously registered what had happened. The center vehicle's driver braked hard, controlled, and held position. Then the rifle fire started from both ridge lines simultaneously. It was disciplined and coordinated, the kind of fire that comes from people who have done this before and chosen their positions carefully. The rounds hit the armored body of the center vehicle in a pattern that was clearly designed to keep it stationary rather than push through. They were not trying to destroy this vehicle, they were trying to pin it. "Down," Rail said from the front seat, and the word carried enough weight that it did not require repeating. Sloane was already low. Dario was not quite. He was watching the ridge lines through the window with a focused, analytical attention that under different circumstances might have looked academic. "East Ridge," he said to Rail. "The west is suppression. The actual threat is coming from the east." "Agreed," Rail said. He had his phone in his hand and was already talking into it in a low, rapid voice, coordinating with the trailing vehicle behind them. He looked back at Dario. "The rear vehicle is mobile. If we back out now, we can clear the south end of the canyon before they reposition." "They'll have the south end covered," Dario said. "Probably," Rail said. "But covered is not the same as blocked." A round hit the window beside Dario's head and spread into the reinforced glass in a pattern of white fractures that held without yielding. Sloane looked at it for exactly 1 second, then looked away from it. "Sloane," Dario said, without raising his voice. "You are going to move to the rear vehicle on my instruction. Not before. Keep your head below the window line and keep the drive in your jacket, not your hand." She had already put the drive in her pocket while he was speaking. "Understood," she said. Rail ran the countermaneuver with the precision of someone who has clearly practiced for exactly this kind of situation and deeply hoped never to need the practice. He coordinated a simultaneous reversal, the center vehicle and the trailing vehicle moving back through the canyon in a tight, controlled withdrawal, while the rear team laid down enough returning fire from the trailing vehicle to break the rhythm of the ridgeline shooters. It was not elegant. It was not clean. But it worked, in the way that functional things work when they are built by people who have prioritized survival over appearances. The center vehicle's rear door opened. Dario moved first, then turned back and held a hand out for Sloane, not a chivalrous gesture, a practical one, steadying her across the gap between vehicles in the dark while rounds were still hitting the road surface around them. She made the transfer in 4 steps. The door closed. The convoy completed its reversal and cleared the south mouth of the canyon at 11:28, 8 minutes after the first round hit. In the vehicle, nobody spoke for almost 2 full minutes. Then Rail's phone rang. He answered it, listened, and set it down on the seat beside him without saying anything further. Sloane looked at the back of his head and understood from the set of his shoulders what the call had contained before he turned around to confirm it. Yusuf and Brennan, Rail said quietly, looking at Dario. The lead vehicle. Dario absorbed that without visible reaction. He looked forward through the windshield at the dark road ahead of them and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Yusuf and Brennan, in a tone that was not an expression of grief exactly, but was the deliberate act of committing two names to a place in his memory where they would not be forgotten. He did not say anything else about it. He did not need to. They reached the estate at midnight, through a route that added 20 minutes to the journey, and used 3 different road changes that Rail called out from memory without consulting anything. The estate sat behind a low stone wall on a private road that was not listed on any public map, which Sloane noted with the detached professional appreciation of someone who has spent 6 years studying how people hide things. The main building was a wide, 2-story structure, stone-faced, understated, and clearly retrofitted in ways that its original architect had not intended. Reinforced shutters on the ground floor windows, a secondary gate on the interior courtyard. Lights already on throughout the building, which meant Corso had done exactly what Dario asked. Inside, the estate had the atmosphere of a command post that had been furnished by someone who did not want it to feel like one. There were proper rooms, proper furniture, and a study on the ground floor with a long table and a wall of bookshelves that had clearly been used for something more consequential than reading. Sloane was shown to a room on the first floor, told that the perimeter was staffed at 6 points, and left to rest. She did not rest. She sat at the small desk in the room, opened the air-gapped laptop that Rail had brought from the Meridian room, and went back to work. The canyon ambush had clarified something that the warehouse fire had only implied. The Varkov syndicate had not followed them from the city by chance, and they had not picked the canyon stretch by coincidence. Someone had known the convoy's departure time, known the intended route, and passed that information to people who had been positioned on those ridge lines for at least 2 hours before the convoy arrived. Setting up that kind of operation takes preparation. Preparation takes information. And the only people who had known both the departure time and the route were inside this building right now. Sloane pulled up the Varkov partition of the drive and started with the financial trail, because the financial trail was always where the truth lived. People lied in conversation. They dissembled in meetings. But money, once it moved, left a record that required considerably more effort to erase than most people anticipated. She found the first transfer inside 40 minutes. It was a recurring payment, $1.8 million, moving on an irregular schedule across 11 months, routed through a logistics company in Latvia, a holding entity in Malta, and a consultancy registration in Dublin that had no employees, no website, and no purpose beyond existing on paper. The destination account had no name attached to it at the Varkov end of the ledger. But the Malta entity's registration documents, buried 3 pages deep in a corporate filing that someone had clearly hoped nobody would ever read, listed a local director of record. That director shared a surname with a property purchase Sloane had noticed in an unrelated entry 2 partitions earlier. She cross-referenced it twice. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she went downstairs. Dario was in the study with Rail and a man she had not been introduced to, reviewing what appeared to be a hand-drawn layout of the canyon stretch. They looked up when she came in. She set the laptop on the table, turned it toward Dario, and pointed to the transfer chain without saying anything first. He looked at it. He followed the chain with his eyes the same way he had followed the Cyprus accounts, steadily, without rushing, reading each layer the way you read a sentence rather than a list. When he reached the end, he was quiet for a moment. Property in Malta, he said, registered to a director whose surname matches a purchase I found in your operational accounts, Sloane said. A car, paid for 18 months ago, which is 7 months before the transfers started. It was paid for in cash, registered under a holding name, and the make and model match an insurance record associated with the name Cassio Rain. She looked at him steadily. I assume that name means something to you. Study was very quiet. Rail had gone completely still in the way that large, capable people go still when they are processing something that requires the full use of their attention. The third man at the table had taken a small, almost imperceptible step back, which was probably a sensible instinct. Dario looked at the screen for another moment. Then he closed the laptop gently, straightened up, and looked at Sloane. "How confident are you?" he asked. "The transfer chain is documented," she said. "The corporate registration is a matter of public record that I pulled from a Maltese government filing database. The car registration is corroborated by 2 independent sources on the drive." She paused. "I'm as confident as the paper trail allows me to be, and the paper trail is very thorough." Dario nodded once. It was a small, clean movement that contained no visible emotion whatsoever. "Thank you," he said, with the same tone he might use to thank someone for passing him a document. Then he looked at Rael and said, "Give me the room for a few minutes." Rael guided Sloane into the corridor with a hand that was polite and left no room for discussion. The third man followed without being asked. The study door closed behind them. Sloane stood in the corridor and looked at the wall. She was a forensic investigator. She was very good at understanding what evidence implied. She did not ask Rael any questions. 4 minutes and 20 seconds later, she counted, because counting was the kind of thing her brain did when it was trying to stay occupied. The study door opened and Dario stepped back into the corridor. He was alone. He looked at Sloane with his standard expression and said, "The convoy route that was used tonight will not be used again." Then he walked past her toward the main room and added, without turning back, "Get some sleep, Ms. Mercer. Tomorrow is going to require you at full capacity." The subject of Cassio Rain was not raised again. Not that night, and not ever. She slept for 4 hours, which was 3 more than she expected and 1 less than she needed. By 6 in the morning, she was back at the desk, and by 7, she had eaten something that Corso's overnight staff had left outside the door and was reviewing the full dataset on the laptop for the last time. Not because she doubted it. She had stopped doubting it somewhere around month 3 of building it, but because once she sent it, she would not get a second attempt. The transfer was a one-way door. She wanted to be certain she was walking through it with everything in order. Dario appeared in the doorway at 7:30 with 2 cups of coffee, set one on the desk without being asked, and looked at the screen. "How long to prepare the transfer package?" he asked. "It's already prepared," she said. "I built the distribution framework before I left the unit. 7 endpoints, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, 2 federal prosecutors I know are outside Kren's network, and 4 investigative desks at outlets that have the reach to make suppression legally impossible once the first story runs." She picked up the coffee. "The moment I initiate, all 7 receive simultaneously. Kren can't pull it back from one without the other 6 going public in response. The Varkov financial architecture is included in full. Everything," she said. "Import ledgers, transfer chains, the ghost asset network, the shell company registrations, and the documented connection to Kren's infrastructure contracts." She looked at him. "Your dock operation is referenced in the ledger because Varkov's people were running through it. I can't remove that without compromising the chain of evidence. You should know that before I send." Dario considered that for exactly the length of time it deserved, which was not very long. "Send it," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "That implicates your operation." "My operation can survive scrutiny," he said. "Varkov's cannot. That distinction is the entire point." He picked up his own coffee and stepped back from the desk. "Send it, Ms. Mercer." She turned back to the screen, connected the drive to the laptop's transfer port, entered the second decryption key, and opened the distribution interface she had built into the drive's architecture on the 3rd night after she had found the first transfer and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has just realized how much trouble they are in, that she was going to need an exit strategy that did not involve the front door of a federal building. The transfer initiated at 7:41 in the morning. The progress bar was, as progress bars always are, deeply unsatisfying to watch. 11 minutes of moving a line across a screen while somewhere on the other side of several encrypted channels, 31 months of financial crime documentation was arriving in the inboxes of people who had the authority, and she was reasonably confident, the motivation to act on it. At 7:48, her phone, a prepaid unit Rail had provided the previous evening, received a notification from an automated news aggregator she had set up months earlier to monitor any coverage related to Kren's name. She looked at it and felt something settle in her chest that she could not immediately name. "The first story is live," she said. Dario looked up from his phone across the room. "Financial Crimes Investigative Desk," she said. "They've led with the Cyprus accounts and Kren's name in the headline. She set the phone down. His political protection for Varkov is gone. The moment that story ran, every other politician in this city who has been standing next to Kren at public functions in the last 3 years is currently calling their own lawyer. Mourning for lawyers, Dario said. Genuinely excellent mourning for lawyers, she agreed. The transfer completed at 7:52. Sloane removed the drive, closed the laptop, and held the drive in her hand for a moment. It was a strange sensation, carrying something that had nearly killed her 3 times in 36 hours, and now it was simply a piece of hardware with an empty purpose. She put it in her jacket pocket and stood up. Then the perimeter alarm sounded. It was not a loud alarm. It was a low, sustained tone that came from a panel in the corridor outside, the kind of sound that is designed to be heard only by the people inside the building, and to give them enough time to do something useful before the situation outside the walls stopped being theoretical. Rail's voice came through the estate's internal comms a few seconds later, clear and precise. Eastern wall. Multiple points of entry. I'm counting at least 14 on the exterior cameras, probably more on the blind side. He paused for exactly 1 second. They're already on the grounds. Dario set down his coffee cup with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided that the time for coffee has concluded. He looked at Sloane with an expression that was, for the first time since she had met him, something approaching direct. The transfer is complete, he said. It was not a question. 7 minutes ago, she said. He nodded, and something in his posture changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would read as obvious to anyone who hadn't spent the last 36 hours watching him closely. But the particular quality of his stillness shifted from patience into something else. Something that had been waiting behind the patience the entire time and had simply been in no hurry to arrive. Stay in this room, he said. Away from the windows. If Rail comes for you, go with him immediately and don't ask questions until you're in the vehicle. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and moved toward the door. The data is sent. Kren is already burning. What happens next in this building is my area of expertise, not yours. He stepped into the corridor and was gone. Outside, on the eastern wall, Mikhail Varkov's men were coming over the top. They were too late, and they did not know it yet. Sloane stayed away from the windows because Dario had told her to, and because she had enough professional self-awareness to understand that her particular set of skills did not include anything useful for the next several minutes. What she could do was listen. The first exchange of fire came from the eastern side of the building, sharp, controlled bursts from Rail's team on the roof, answered by heavier, less disciplined fire from ground level. The difference in rhythm told her something immediately. Rail's men were shooting at targets they had already identified from elevated positions. Varkov's men were shooting at a building they could not fully see into and were trying to suppress without knowing exactly where the resistance was coming from. That was not the sound of an assault going according to plan. She found out later, from Rail, that Dario had spent the 3 hours between Cassio's removal and the convoy's arrival at the estate on a single phone call with Corso, rerouting the original defensive plan entirely. The adjustment was straightforward in concept and required considerable precision in execution. Every approach to the main building was quietly redirected through the northern courtyard by way of unlocked gates, drawn lights, and 2 open ground floor doorways that looked, from the exterior, like the path of least resistance. They were not the path of least resistance. They were a 3-sided enclosure with no viable exit once you were inside it, and the gates swung shut behind you. Varkov had committed 43 men to this operation. That number, Sloane reflected, said everything about the state of his thinking. A man who sends his full available force to one location has run out of strategic options and has moved into the territory of hopping that volume solves the problem that intelligence failed to solve first. It was the operational equivalent of a very long, very loud sentence that contained no actual argument. Rail coordinated from the roof with the quiet efficiency of someone who had trained for exactly this configuration and was finding it, on some level that he would never openly admit, straightforward. His voice came through the corridor comms at intervals, not urgent, not strained, just precise. Eastern gate secured. A pause. North corridor clear. Another pause. Courtyard is full, close it. And then the courtyard was closed. What followed took 11 minutes. Sloane knew this because she counted. sitting on the floor of the study with her back against the wall and the empty drive in her hand, which she held not because it still contained anything, but because holding it gave her hands something to do that was not shaking. She was not ashamed of this. She was a forensic investigator, not a soldier, and the sounds coming from the northern courtyard were not sounds she had any framework for beyond the basic human instinct to want them to stop. They stopped at 8:17. The silence afterward was a different quality from the silence before, heavier, more settled, the kind that follows the end of something rather than the anticipation of it. Dario's voice came through the comms once briefly. "Ground floor is clear. Courtyard gate rail." Sloane stood up. She did not go to the window, but she straightened up, because sitting on the floor seemed like the wrong posture for whatever came next. She heard footsteps in the courtyard below, a single set, unhurried, moving across stone. And then a voice she did not recognize, rough-edged and carrying the particular flatness of someone who has accepted a situation without accepting the consequences. "Vesper." A pause, already lost. The voice was accented, Eastern European, measured, and almost convincing. "The men I have waiting in the city will finish what?" "You don't have men waiting in the city," Dario said. His voice was very clear in the morning air. "You spent them all last night on a canyon stretch and tonight on a courtyard that I designed for this specific purpose." A brief pause. "You've been watching my operation for 11 months through a man who is no longer available to take your calls. What you know about my current position is 11 months out of date." Silence from the courtyard. "Drive has been sent," Dario continued, in the same even tone. "Kren is already in the process of being arrested. Your financial infrastructure is on the front page of 4 separate publications as of 40 minutes ago. The political protection is gone, the money chain is gone, and the 42 men you brought to this estate tonight are gone." He paused. "This conversation exists only because I intended to have it. I wanted to say 2 names to you before we finished." A longer silence. "Yusuf," Dario said. "And Brennan." Sloane closed her eyes for a moment. She did not hear the shot. She heard a single, clean sound that was not quite a shot in the way that people describe shots in films. It was shorter and more final than that, and the courtyard went completely silent in its wake with the immediacy of a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. Then Rail's voice on the comms. "Courtyard secure." Sloane opened her eyes. She walked to the study door, opened it, and stood in the corridor. Corso's staff had already begun moving through the ground floor with the brisk, focused energy of people who have a great deal of work to do before morning becomes afternoon. Nobody was running. Nobody was raising their voice. The estate was returning to its operational baseline with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized everything in Dario Vesper's world from the moment she had first fallen through his door. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at the ceiling and thought, with the particular detachment of someone running on 4 hours of sleep and 1 cup of coffee, that she had just watched an entire criminal syndicate get dismantled in 36 hours through a combination of financial documentation and architectural geometry. And that, in a way, was the most educational thing she had witnessed in 6 years of federal service. The courtyard was quiet by the time the first light arrived. Not the performed quiet of a place waiting for something to happen, but the genuine, settled quiet of a place where everything that was going to happen had already happened, and the air had accepted that. Corso's people had been working through the pre-dawn hours with the wordless discipline of a crew that understood their job, did not come with the option of asking questions. And by the time the sky above the estate's stone walls began shifting from black to the particular deep blue that precedes a proper sunrise, the northern courtyard looked like a courtyard again, rather than a record of the night's events. Sloane stood at the study window and watched the light come in. She was still in yesterday's clothes because nobody had offered her anything else, and she had not thought to ask, which told her something about where her head had been for the past several hours. Her side ached in the steady, ignorable way it had settled into since Dr. Fenwick's work 2 nights ago, and her eyes felt the specific dryness of someone who has been awake for too long and is currently running on the last functional reserves of a body that has decided to file a formal complaint at the earliest available opportunity. Her phone buzzed at 6:04 in the morning. It was the news aggregator. She looked at the notification, read it twice, and set the phone face down on the windowsill. "Kren," Dario's voice came from behind her. She had not heard him come in, which either meant she was more exhausted than she realized, or he moved very quietly as a matter of habit. Probably both. Federal custody as of 6 o'clock, she said. The IRS and the DOJ filed jointly. They moved faster than I expected, which means the prosecutors I sent the data to had already been building a parallel case and were waiting for the piece I was carrying. She paused. They'll have enough to hold him for the rest of his natural life. The infrastructure contract fraud alone carries a federal minimum that most people don't survive long enough to complete. The Varkov financial network, Dario asked. Frozen, she said. All 7 jurisdictions moved simultaneously, which is genuinely rare and suggests someone made a phone call at a very senior level very early this morning. She looked out at the courtyard. The ghost assets are gone. Whatever Varkov's people had left outside this estate, it's now property of 4 separate governments and a very busy team of forensic accountants who are going to spend the next 2 years untangling it. She allowed herself a small pause. They're going to find my work in there, the methodology. People in my field are going to recognize the transfer mapping structure and know who built it. That concern you? Dario asked. She considered that honestly. It would have 36 hours ago, she said. He did not respond to that immediately, and she did not turn from the window. Outside, a bird had started somewhere in the stone wall's upper edge, a small, ordinary sound that had no awareness of how strange it was to exist in the same morning as everything that had just concluded in the same space. She heard Dario move to the side table. The sound of a glass being set down, and then a second one beside it. The quiet, unhurried pour of something that was clearly not breakfast in the traditional sense, but was clearly not going to be apologized for either. I'm not going to offer you a route out of the city, he said. She turned from the window then. He was standing beside the low table near the bookshelves, 2 whiskey glasses in front of him, his jacket off for what she realized was the first time since she had met him. He looked, in a way that she found mildly disorienting, like an ordinary person. A tired one. You said at the beginning that your terms were medical cover, protection, and an exit route, he said. The first 2 have been met. The third one I'm withdrawing, not because I intend to keep you here against your will, but because I think you already understand that leaving is the less interesting option. He looked at her steadily. The Varkov financial network is frozen but not mapped. The accounts exist in fragments across 7 jurisdictions and 4 legal systems. The people who froze them are going to spend years trying to reconstruct the full architecture, and they are going to fail, because the people who can do that kind of reconstruction work do not typically take government salaries. Sloane looked at the second glass on the table. You want me to map it, she said. I want you to own it, he said. The intelligence side of everything I intend to build from this point forward. Not as a consultant, not as a contractor, and not as a woman who wandered in from a drainage channel with a useful flash drive. He paused. Properly, with authority, with full access to operational information, and with the understanding that what you build here will be considerably more consequential than anything the Financial Crimes Unit would have permitted you to construct within their filing system. Room was quiet for a moment. Sloane walked to the table and picked up the second glass. She did not drink from it immediately. She held it and looked at him with the direct, assessing attention that she had been trained to apply to financial documents and had, over the past 36 hours, found equally applicable to people. Want full autonomy on the intelligence architecture, she said. No override, no committee, no approval chain. If I identify a financial risk, it gets acted on. Agreed, he said. And I want Rail to fix the lock on the Meridian Room's service entrance, she said. The secondary tumbler bypass is a liability. Something shifted at the corner of Dario Vesper's mouth. It was the closest thing to an unguarded expression she had seen from him, and it lasted approximately 1 second before his face returned to its default composure. I'll have it seen to this week, he said. She nodded and drank. The woman who had believed in the system, who had built 6 years of professional identity around the badge and the protocol and the chain of command, had walked through a freight door 2 nights ago bleeding and running, and certain that the only thing standing between her and a very permanent silence was a data drive and a sufficiently motivated criminal. She was not the one standing here now. That woman had been useful. This one was going to be considerably more dangerous. Outside, the city was catching its first full light of morning, spreading gold and indifferent across rooftops that had no idea what had been decided in a stone estate on their outskirts while they were sleeping. Senator Kren was in a federal holding room. The Varkov syndicate was a frozen set of accounts, and a courtyard that Corso's people had already finished cleaning. And in a study lined with books that nobody read, two people who did not trust each other had just agreed to build something that neither of them could have built alone. Which was, when you considered it carefully, the most honest foundation either of them had ever worked from. Thank you for watching till the end. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more thrilling stories like this one. See you in the next video.